with another talk story, paddling tips. And today I want to talk to you about paddling in the wind. And ironically, I have the most gorgeous day with absolutely no wind, which is perfect for making this video. So first things first, paddling in general, but especially when you're paddling when it's windy. Safety is really important. So when you should always have a leash and a way to attach yourself to the board, because you never know what's going to happen. But especially in the wind, if your board gets away from you, it is very light. It glides on top of the water, and even if you're a strong swimmer, the board can move away faster from you than you can catch it. And the windier it is, the faster that happens. So paddling in the wind, please always wear a leash. PFDs in most places are recommended and or required as well. Somebody should know where you're paddling, how long you intend to be out, where you're going, and when you'll be back. Before I go paddle, I note which direction is the wind coming from when I'm going to go for a paddle. I want to know if the wind is coming, right at my face, if it's coming along the side shore, or if it's blowing offshore. I always want to know before I paddle which direction the wind is heading, and if at all possible, I want to paddle first into the wind, because that way, when I'm tired and I turn around to paddle back, the wind is behind me and it's helping me get back. Whereas the opposite, if you paddle directly downwind and then you turned around to paddle back, paddling into the wind, and you probably, if you're watching this, paddling upwind is a lot harder and a lot slower than paddling downwind or with the wind. And so you always want to, if you have the option, paddle upwind first so that your way home is easier for you. And so just being mindful, if the wind is blowing offshore of where you're paddling, and so if you paddle off, say, a beach, and you're going downwind to go off the beach, what I do is I just try and not go too far offshore on those days. I stay close because I know that the wind is pushing me off and it's going to be harder to come back, right? And the more experience you get and the more you work on these tips I'm going to give you now, the easier that'll be to paddle in wind in all directions. So a mistake that I see people make a lot of times is the nose of their board. They don't want it to go into the chop and kind of get stuck and feel like you hit the brakes every time you hit some chop. And so they end up taking this step back on their board, so the nose of their board rides up. And while that does make it easier to go up over a chop, the thing about paddling upwind is you want to try and learn how to be a little bit more dynamic. So while yes, getting the nose of your board up is the right kind of thought process to be having, you don't want to just stand back way behind your handle and paddle, because what I'm doing now is I'm sinking my tail. So I'm actually kind of, when a boat starts to get up on a plane and it sinks its tail, the stern of the boat down, and it makes this big wake and it's really heavy, right? So like that's what you're doing when you're sinking the tail of your board. You're dragging that and you're making that heavier for you. And so this is not an optimal position to be in on your board. So what I would do instead is I would, preferably, I would actually take a staggered stance. So I actually do put one foot kind of back and one foot kind of forward. And so and rather than taking a big step back and stepping back there, I can just kind of lean my weight back a little bit on my back leg to lighten the front of my board and get it up over the chop. And then I can bring my weight back forward onto my front foot, or balanced between my 2 feet once I'm over that chop, because it's not like you're constantly paddling upwind. It's like there's a little chop and then you're down, and then there's a little chop and then you're down. It's very dynamic, right? So you want to learn to just kind of lean your body weight back to try and get your nose up, and then or maybe that's taking just a step back like this, and then you're back forwards, right? So if you haven't watched my movie or my video, my live from 2 weeks ago on moving your feet, that one would be really helpful too. Give the nose of the board up and then keep paddling. So you don't want to stay back here. So if you're, again, depending on if you're in a board that's really optimized for flat water paddling, the nose of your board, there's no way you're going to be able to keep it riding up on top of all of the chop. You can get a really nice all-water board like the RS, which does a really great job paddling into chop and shedding that water that might come over the nose. But either way, you just want to get good at little movements that help your paddling and shifting your body weight on your board being more dynamic, right? And so it will be paddling side, foot moving back, right? I'm on paddling side. Or again, you can just stay in a little bit of a staggered position with your feet, typically paddling side back. You can stay with your feet parallel and just, there's not really a way with your feet parallel to get your body weight to shift forward and backwards that much. Just know that you don't want to just stand all the way back here. When you're paddling upwind, another tip that I have is to try and keep the board pointing as close as you can to directly upwind. Unless you're trying to follow a specific course and you don't have that option, in which case the next video will be more helpful for you. Keeping the nose of your board pointing directly into the wind is going to be really helpful. So, because as soon as your board, so say the wind is coming from this direction, as soon as your board is at an angle to the wind is going to be able to catch more surface area and push you off the wind. So, the closer you can stay to pointing directly into the wind, the easier it is for you to keep tracking, and the less hard you're going to have to work to keep correcting yourself to paddle really hard to get yourself to turn back directly upwind. So how do we do that? We work on our steering, another video that I did a few weeks ago. I'll have to put in the comments box the links to these so you can watch them. We work on our steering, and worst case scenario, if you're not a skilled paddler, you're just going to change sides a little bit more. You're going to change sides a little bit more frequently to try and keep the nose pointing upwind. And if that's something that is difficult for you, you definitely want to work on steering your board. So tune in next time, and I'll link another video that'll help you with that as well. So pointing, so the first tip was, learn to shift your body weight, but don't just stand all the way back to get your nose up. The second tip I had for you was try and keep the nose of your board pointing straight into the wind as much as possible. As soon as you veer off to one side or the other, it's harder to make that correction back. A third tip that I have for you is, you heard me mention the reason it's harder to make corrections is because of the surface area of your board and the wind pushing against it. And so our bodies actually present quite a bit of surface area to the wind as well. And so the taller or the bigger I am, so paddling upwind, actually bigger people have a little bit of a disadvantage, although it's all a strength to weight to size kind of ratio thing happening. And the smaller you are and the shorter you are, the less surface area you present to the wind. And so either way, you can use that to your advantage, thinking I'm bigger, I'm stronger, or I'm smaller, I'm less, I have less surface area. Either way, you want to put that in your head to kind of give yourself an advantage when you're paddling upwind. I think that's really helpful too, is a little mental positive thought to put in your head, to thinking why paddling upwind, what advantage you have to paddling upwind, rather than a lot of people tend to think about all the disadvantages to paddling upwind, right? And then they get in an upwind situation and they're like, right? And Larry Mary Kane in Paddle Monster has this great expression that's love the conditions, right? And part for me of loving the conditions is finding in my head, no matter what, an advantage that I have in those conditions, right? Because we all have different strengths and weaknesses. So, so paddling upwind, that being said, the smaller you can make yourself, the less surface area you have. So it does help to get a little bit lower down when you're paddling upwind. And so you'll often see paddlers do this choke stroke where they're grabbing below the T handle, and that allows you to get just a little bit lower, or it kind of forces you to get a little bit lower. And so when you are lower down to the water, it's easier to take, it essentially shortens the length of your paddle. So it makes it easier to take faster strokes, getting the paddle in and out of the water more quickly. And it also allows you to get down a little bit lower and generate a little more power in your legs, maybe use a little more torque. And so the lower you are, and that's part of the reason why paddle lengths have been historically getting shorter and shorter, the lower you are to the water, to a certain degree, to a certain extent, does increase your ability to generate speed. But paddling upwind, it reduces your surface area that the wind is pressing against. So you don't have to use a choke stroke, but if working on paddling better upwind is something that you are working on, maybe that's something you want to try to experiment with a little bit. But whether you're choke stroking or not, just getting a little bit lower when you're paddling upwind is going to help you too. Bending those knees a little bit more deeply and maybe staying down a little bit lower. Not bending over like this and looking down, but bending in the legs a little bit. When you're paddling into the wind, as soon as your paddle's out of the water, and that's also when you're kind of standing up a little bit, right? So this is when you're trying to rely on glide to maintain you to your next stroke. However, in the wind, when you're paddling into the wind, the moment you stand up, your glide is being significantly slowed down by the wind or the chop coming at you, right? So you want to minimize the amount of time that your paddle is out of the water. So taking quicker strokes and getting your paddle back in the water a little more quickly. Let me show you an example of what that doesn't look like and what that does look like. Okay. So this is me paddling, sort of at a regular pace and standing up, kind of taking my time to get back my paddle in the water, right? And then let me show you. If I click to get my paddle back in the water. Shorter strokes. So again, things that can help with that are choking down on your paddle. Maybe that works for you, maybe it doesn't. It takes a little practice, but that's not something you're used to. Going to get down a little lower. You're going to try and get that paddle back in the water really quickly. optimize your glide between strokes, if you're trying to think about optimizing or reducing the amount of time that the paddle's out of the water and optimizing the amount of time that the paddle is in the water, resisting the wind and the chop that you're trying to paddle into. So those are the tips I wanted to give you today for paddling upwind. Safety was always wear a leash and, you know, have somebody who knows where and when you're paddling, and always try and paddle upwind first. At least, at the very least, you need to know the wind direction before you go paddling. And then my tips were, you know, trying to paddle a little bit more dynamically with your body weight, maybe a staggered stance, or maybe just a little step back whenever there's a big chop, to try and lighten the nose of your board, but not drag the tail of your board as you're paddling upwind, right? And then I said to get down, and then I said to paddle, try and keep the nose of your board as much as you can pointing straight into the wind, rather than zigzagging too much from side to side and having to make big corrections. So work on your steering and maneuvering. And then I said, get down a little bit lower when you're paddling upwind and try and minimize the amount of time that your paddle is out of the water. So faster, shorter strokes tend to be a little bit faster upwind, or at least just faster strokes. Maybe they're not shorter or easier, but I hope that those tips are very helpful for you. I'm now drenched in sweat and I haven't even done a workout. And tune in, I will put in the chat your questions about the next section of the next video I want to do, which is about paddling when there's wind coming from one side or the other. We'll talk a little bit more about steering. And if there's anything I didn't answer for today, of course, put that in the comments and questions as well. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a beautiful day, and happy paddling.